Aloha, everyone. Today, I wanted to talk about kind of some observations and I guess kind of a theory that I had about Back to the Future. I love the Back to the Future movies. I'm not the only one. I mean, there's probably some of the most beloved movies of my generation, at least. But I absolutely adore those movies. Those are fantastic. That duo of Doc Brown and Marty McFly. I watched the trilogy again recently, and that duo, just to see them working off of each other, it's just incredibly entertaining to watch. Those two are so good together. It's just so much fun. I'm not really here to review the movie so much as I am here to talk about my theory that I have about it. Mostly about Part 2 and Part 3. And there will be I will be talking about details of the trilogy. So if you haven't seen the Back to the Future trilogy, stop watching here. Go watch the Back to the Future trilogy because you'll thank me for it. Watch the Back to the Future trilogy if you haven't seen it. They are as good as everybody says they are. They are just that fantastic. There's enough sci-fi that if you're a sci-fi geek like me, you'll love it for the sci-fi. But if you're not a sci-fi geek, there's enough stuff about character relationships, friendships, a community that and how it changes over time, over 30 years, over 100 years. There's just fun adventure. Is just that much good stuff in it that if you're a sci-fi geek, you'll love it. If you're not a sci-fi geek, you'll probably still love it. So yeah, go watch them and come back here. So my theory is that when we start watching Back to the Future Part 2, we're not seeing the same Marty that we watched in Back to the Future Part 1. In Back to the Future Part 2, Marty has been changed to reflect the changes in the timeline. There's this thing they call a ripple effect, which we see on screen. It changes photographs in newspapers. When the past is changed, it will change them. It will cause them to transform, sometimes before our eyes, into the new timeline's version of that. And that has to happen with characters too. In fact, it almost does happen with Marty himself in Part 1. He almost fades from existence up on the stage at the Enchantment Under the Sea dance. And the timeline corrects itself just in time so that he doesn't do that. You wonder what would have happened if Marty had in fact faded from existence in full view of an entire crowd on stage there, how they would have reacted to it. But would it really matter? Because if that happened, that would have created a paradox, and as according to Doc Brown, that destroys the entire universe, or possibly just our own galaxy. But yeah, if Marty had not existed, then he wouldn't have gone back in time and prevented himself from existing. So that would have created a paradox. But Marty doesn't fade from existence, and while I'm on the subject of the Enchantment Under the Sea dance, I don't know if there's anybody out there that knows music, but I was watching it recently and I was wondering, Marty turns to the band when they ask him to play another number, and he decides to play Johnny Be Good, which is a song that in 1955 hasn't been written yet. And so when he turns to the band, he tells them, okay, this is a blues riff in B, watch me for the changes and try and keep up. I was wondering, does that really work? Can you get a band to play a song they don't know with just that little information? If one guy on vocals and lead guitar knows the song, can he just say a blues riff in B and watch me for the changes and have the rest of the band know enough from that to be able to play the song? I don't know if that works. I don't know music enough. Does that actually work? Is that all you really need if you're not on the lead in a band in order to be able to play it? I don't know. It seems weird to me. But that seems to be the least of the questions you walk away from Back to the Future with. But anyway, in Back to the Future, Marty goes back in time. He changes past events. He prevents himself from being born, but then creates an alternate sequence of events that will lead to him being born anyway. So in so doing, he affects his parents in a profound way. His influence on his father makes him more self-confident. He learns to stand up to bullies. his influence on his mother makes her less strict, more understanding of, I guess, what what teenagers are going through. So he, in the timeline that he creates, he's still going to be born in that timeline, but he's going to be raised a little bit differently. And most importantly, in that timeline, he's not going to hear the story of how his parents got together as Grandpa hit Dad with the car. That was the story that he had always heard in the original timeline, and that's the knowledge that the Marty we watch comes back with. But the Marty that would have existed in the new timeline that he creates would have come back in time armed with the knowledge that his parents met when a mysterious friend, Calvin Klein, came into their lives for a week and played matchmaker. And so this Marty is not going to go back in time, bump into his parents, realize, oh my gosh, I accidentally interrupted their first meeting. I've got to find another way to get them together. I've got to figure out what to do. This other Marty's going to know more or less what to do, because he's going to go back in time. He's going to think, oh my gosh, this Calvin Klein that got my parents together all those years ago was just me from the future. And now I have to do what they said Calvin Klein did to get them together. So in some ways, this Marty has it a little bit easier in that he knows what he needs to do. Which means that the interactions that he has with his parents are going to play out more or less the same. But you have to figure that his interactions with the Doc played out a little differently. When he talks to Doc about what happened to him in the since he came back, he's not going to be when he says, "Well, I accidentally bumped into my parents," he's going to elaborate and says, the parents got together because of this Calvin Klein, and they called me Calvin Klein, and so on. So his conversations with Doc would have gone a little bit differently. So it is I believe the Marty that did that we pick up with in part 2. Not the Marty that we saw that came back from 1955 and was surprised by how different everything was. This Marty would have come back and been relieved that everything was back to normal. From his perspective, his father being an author and Biff being an auto detailer, and his mother being thinner and less strict would have all been normal. Because when we start Back to the Future Part 2, they repeat the final scene of Part 1. But all his reactions to how surprised he was to see the changes, that all happened before that. We see the scene where he goes out, looks at his new truck. Jennifer pops out and asks for a ride, but then Doc shows up and tells them there's a problem with his kids in the future, and he's got to take them to the future. I believe the ripple effect that changes Marty's memories to match the new timeline happens in this scene, and that's why we see it repeated. And I believe the new version of Marty, when he goes back to 1955, because he would have done things a little differently, I think that he must have in some way met and influenced Jennifer's parents in this version of the timeline, because that's why we see Jennifer looks different. Jennifer looks more like Elizabeth Shue in the altered timeline than like Claudia Wells. And this is and that's not a theory that I've had alone. I think other people have had that theory to explain away that change in casting. But I think that just goes to further support the fact that we are looking at an altered timeline already when we are watching Back to the Future Part 2, and then everything has already rippled into the new timeline. Everything now matches the new timeline, including Marty's memories. And I think that I watched the Part 2 and Part 3, looking to see if there's any other reference to that original version of 1985, in which with the wimpy George McFly working for Biff. And I only saw one in Back to the Future Part 2, but it was still vague enough that it could still work, even if you're thinking of this being the alternate Marty, which I am. In the Cafe 80s in Part 2, when old Biff shows up and he calls Marty's father a loser, thinking he's talking to Marty Jr., and he's talking about Marty Sr. Marty is confused and thinks he's talking about George McFly, and he says, I happen to know George McFly is no longer a loser. And my interpretation of that originally was, I happen to know that I went back in time and changed my father so that he's no longer a loser. And that would be like the common sense interpretation of that line. But I think it still works when you consider that, regardless of which version of Marty this is, from his perspective, he just came back from 1955 yesterday. So he still just spent a week with teenage George McFly. And that's still fresh in his memory. And teenage George McFly was still, wimpy George McFly at that point, until, the moment he stands up to Biff. And Marty just watched that happen. So when he's saying George McFly is no longer a loser, he could be talking about, the teenage George McFly that is fresh in his memory, who stood up to Biff and he saw, become more self-confident in that moment. So that is really the only thing that would throw a monkey wrench into this theory, and I think it can still work. Furthermore, I think there's further evidence that we are seeing an altered Marty, because in Part 2 and Part 3, it's kind of a major character beat for Marty, that he has a serious character flaw, in that he cannot stand for anyone to think that he's afraid to do something. If he's called a chicken or he's called yellow, he cannot let that go. He must confront the person who did that. And that, I think, is likely going to be the result of being raised by a George McFly who learned to stand up to bullies. If this George McFly learned to stand up to bullies, he would have taught his kids, never let a bully think you're afraid of them. Always stand up to bullies. Never let them get the better of you. And this Marty probably took that lesson a little bit too much to heart, so that he just psychologically cannot let that go if he's called a chicken. And I think that's a result of the altered timeline. That's one way in which his personality is a little bit different. I mean, otherwise he's still pretty much Marty, but in the altered timeline he has this prominent character flaw that doesn't show up at all in Part 1. So I think that you put these things together, and at least, in my head at least, I think that it makes sense to me to think of Marty from Part 2 on as being the alternate version of Marty, as being the Marty that we saw at the end of the first Back to the Future for a few moments, getting into the DeLorean and going back in time, while the Marty we've been watching is watching him from a distance at the Lone Pine Mall. So that is basically my theory. What do you think? Do you think what I'm saying makes sense? Do you think I'm just crazy? Do you think it's just the same Marty with the same memories all along? Like, comment, subscribe, and that's a wrap, folks.